Today, I want to look at how the global economy will collapse. Specifically, how the US economy will collapse because of this war. Now, the argument I want to make to you today is that financial collapse do not happen accidentally or naturally. It has to be engineered. And this is a very hard concept for us to understand, okay? So in economics, there's something called the boom-bust cycle. Which basically states that in capitalism, you have the economy booming, then suddenly, for whatever reason, it collapses, okay? It's called a boom-bust cycle. And the idea is that if you study economics, they teach you that this is just a natural part of capitalism because in good times, people spend too much money. They become overconfident. And so then they waste a lot of money and then it collapses. The economy turns bad. And so you have to focus on being more lean and efficient and resilient. So think of, gaining weight, okay? You gain too much weight and then you feel bad, so then you lose weight. And that's the idea of the boom-bust cycle. The problem, though, is that no one can explain properly how and why suddenly the bubble pops, okay? What is the mechanism or trigger for the collapse? If you study economics, you will never ever know the answer. So we are going to focus on speculation today, okay? So again, the internet knows this, but I've never studied economics. I don't know much about economics, but I'm curious as to why this happens, okay? Why is it that bubbles pop? How do economies rise and fall, okay? So I'm not an expert. I'm not even a professor. Yes, I understand. But what I do is I engage in speculation for fun, for entertainment, okay? So just see this as a fun class where we're gonna explore some fun topics that have no scholarly basis, okay? All right? So just keep this in mind, guys. All right, so let's look at very quickly the main explanation for why booms and busts happens. And this is from Andrew Ross Sorkin, who is probably the most influential financial journalist in America. And he wrote a book called 1929, which looks at the stock market collapse of 1929, and he offers a very good explanation as to why it happened. Okay, so Amber, could you read for me, please?
Of course. Lengthy, uninterrupted booms like the one in the 1920s produce a collective delusion. Optimism becomes a drug or a religion or some combination of both. People lose their ability to calculate risk and distinguish between good ideas and bad ones.
Okay, so again, this is a standard explanation for why there's a bubble burst, because it's delusional and then it's like you fly too high, okay? But you're not supposed to fly, so then you fall down to the ground eventually. It's just gravity, okay? The idea of gravity. But what I want to show you today is there's actually another explanation, which is this is all being engineered. There are people behind the scenes who have the power to cause economies to rise and to fall, okay? So let me give you an example of this. All right, let's just say you're a bank. All right, you're a bank. And your job is to take those money, save it, and then use it properly in order to promote the economy, okay? So let's just say we put $1 million into the bank, okay? And what does the bank do with it? The bank then lends it out to entrepreneurs, right? So maybe I want to start a restaurant, and so I borrow $1 million from the bank, okay? Question, how much money is in the bank now? It's to be zero, right? Okay, that's just math, guys. Look, if I take in $1 million and I lend it out $1 million, I should have zero, because that's just basic math. But that's not the answer. The actual answer is $2 million. And what you need to understand is that each bank has the ability to print its own money. And the bank is a mechanism for liquidity in the economy, okay? And this is a great illusion. This is the delusion, okay? Behind the economy, where money is just an idea, it's a concept, it's a collective hallucination. All right? Now, but the problem is there are thousands, tens of thousands of banks everywhere. So how do they know how to coordinate together? Okay? And this is something else you need to understand about the system. There's actually something called a signaling mechanism. Okay? So all these banks are separate, but they are linked together into something called a central bank. Okay? A central bank. And what does the central bank do? The central bank signals whether or not to lend money or not to lend money. And this mechanism is called the interest rate. Okay? Now, again, if you study economics, what they will teach you is that depending on the interest rate, if it's low, maybe 1%, or 5%, or high 5%, then that will determine how consumers behave. If the interest rate is 1%, what this means is I can go to the bank, get money, and buy a house, right? If it's too high, 5%, then I don't want to go to the bank to buy a house. And this is what you're taught in economics class. But there's actually another explanation, which is the interest rate is not to signal consumers or homeowners to buy, but rather for banks to lend or not. Okay, does that make sense? Because the banks, what they can do is, depending on the interest rate, they know that, okay, my job is to release more liquidity into the system, release more money into the system, and therefore I will make it easier to take out a loan, okay? But if the interest rate is high, then I know, okay, I must not release too much liquidity in the system, therefore I will make the loan application hard, okay? So, in other words, the interest rate is not set in order to guide consumer behavior. It is set in order to coordinate liquidity in the marketplace. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so these are two very curious aspects of this system that people don't really understand. So, in order to understand the system, I will explain to you how the world works, okay? And I explained this before, but I want to summarize and apply it to this scenario, okay? So the first thing to understand is that we live in Plato's cave. Okay? Meaning that we're all chained to the floor and we're all watching a screen. And behind is this great fire where the elite create puppets so that we can collectively hallucinate our own reality. All right? And this mechanism that allows us to coordinate our imagination is, of course, called money. Right? So think of money as God, right? And so what money is doing is it's focusing our minds in a certain way that creates our reality. All right? So remember this idea and keep this in mind. Okay, so because of this concept, this allows us to create the world that we live in today. Okay? So remember how the world is structured. You have the empire, but then you have the game masters. Who are the game masters? They're the people in finance. Okay, and this includes Bank of International Settlements, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, Wall Street, City of London. Okay, so these are different financial organizations that coordinate together, and they are the game masters. And what they do is they control how US dollars, which is the currency of this game, they control how US dollars moves around the system, okay? So USD. And this creates, of course, the global economy. But you cannot allow people to think that they're actually a set of people manipulating this game, because then people will think this is not fair, it's not transparent, right? It's not a clean game. So what you do is you create multilateral organizations called the rules-based international order, like the WTO, UN, and you make them believe that, oh, it's these impartial organizations that actually control the game. So it's fair and it's transparent and it's accountable to the people, okay? And then you reinforce this using media, education, and culture. And together, these three will create the values and norms that make us believe that this is a fair, open, and transparent game in which we can all win, okay? So that when there's a collapse, it's not because there are people engineering this collapse behind the scenes, it's because it's a law of gravity. This just happens naturally in this game. It's no one's fault. It's just like we were too lazy and corrupt, okay? All right, so certain things to remember about the system is that this system is not as clean as you think because there are opposing forces to it. All right, and these opposing forces are forces such as nationalism, okay, or ethnic identity. Then you have social democracy, individual rights, right? And then of course you have religion. All right, so there are these countervailing forces that try to break apart the system. So then what happens is that there are other systems that keep the system in place and respond to these countervailing forces. All right, and they are intelligence, spies basically, crime, and science. And behind these three forces are three sets of powerful institutions, okay? These are transnational capital, secret societies, and the last is elite families, okay? Some people call them the Illuminati, okay? It doesn't matter, all right? So this is how the world works. And underpinning this elite is something called the occult, which we'll study later on, okay? All right, so certain things that stand out about the system that you may notice is, hey guys, look. Transnational capital is also the game masters as well as the global economy, okay? This is important because, remember, this system is the parasite. And this system is a host. So transnational capital is both the parasite as well as the host. It's both the game master as well as the player. Okay? So this obviously leads to a lot of corruption. So then the question then is, how do we get this system? Where did this system come from? So let me go into some history, okay?